So, in our first lesson, we wanted to look at Matthew chapter 24. Though not in details, but there is a specific point we want to pick for the purpose of our study. So before we went to the book of Matthew chapter 24, we wanted to establish the historical context, the historical setting of Matthew chapter 24. So in an attempt to understand the historical context, we went to the book of John chapter 1. So John chapter 1, we saw that the summary of the subject, John chapter 1 is dealing with the word. So we established that the word is Christ. Okay, what then the subsequent verses will be doing, it will tell us the different events that happened under the word, all that the word did. So we went to verse 29 and we saw baptism of the word. And we said the word Christ was baptized in 27 AD. So we then went through a myriad of this history to establish that Christ was baptized in the autumn of 27 AD. So we moved to the book of John chapter 2 verse 13. And we saw that verse 13 is taking us to the Passover. So we said the Passover used to happen in the 14th day of the first month. So we said in verse 29, if we are in the autumn of 27 AD, and to the Jewish economy, the autumn used to happen in the fall of the year. So assuming that chapter 1 and chapter 2 are chronological, so we said in verse 29 we are at the end of 27 AD. It only makes sense that in the next chapter, if we are at the Passover, we are at the Passover of the next year, which is 28 AD. And in chapter 14, 15, we saw Christ carry the first temple cleansing. So when the disciples ask for a sign, Christ tells them, destroy this temple and I will build it in 3 days. So we use the day and year principle to say that one application we can make of the 3 days Christ mentions there is the 3 years that Christ did his mission on earth. So that took us to the spring of 31 AD. So we saw that in the spring of 31 AD, Christ does the second temple cleansing. So thus we concluded that at the beginning of Christ's ministry, he does a temple cleansing. At the end of Christ's ministry, It does a temple cleansing. But when we went to the beginning of Christ's ministry, he was still calling the temple my Father's house. But at the end, when he does the second temple cleansing, we saw that he's divorced the Jewish church, so he calls them, your house is left unto you desolate. So before we go back to Matthew chapter 24, I'd like to read a few verses to confirm that concept. And then we'll move on. So if you go back to the book of Matthew chapter 15 verse 14. So before we go to verse 14, if we remain in verse 1 of chapter 15. It says, then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees which were of Jerusalem. So from verse 1 you can see that Christ is dealing with the Pharisees and the scribes. So when you go back to verse 12, the disciples are going to come to Christ. So, and they knew that the Pharisees were offended. But Jesus is going to answer them in verse 14. And he's going to tell the disciples, let them alone, they be blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. So now we know the conversation has been between Christ and the Pharisees and the scribes. But who are Pharisees? Who are Pharisees and scribes? Who are they in relation to the Jewish church? They were leaders of the Jewish church. So what Christ calls the leaders of the Jewish church, so if that is the Jewish church, we know that when we speak about the Pharisees and the scribes, they were the leaders of the Jewish church. So how Christ calls them? He calls them blind. They are blind leaders leading the blind. So both of them will fall to a ditch. So if we go to the book of Matthew chapter 23, and we go to verse 25. No, I'd like us to start from verse 23. So this is the woes of the Pharisees. The woes. So in verse 23, Christ is going to say, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. So the other word that is it's used to describe them is that the scribes and the Pharisees, they are hypocrites. Alright, so if we go to verse 25, Christ tells them, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess.
in fullesitu garu kesi sani sassata fi of gadisudan butu daya.
So I'm going to assume that is the cup of the Pharisees. So according to Christ, how is the outside of this of the cup of the Pharisees? It's clean. How is the inside? It's dirty. So depending on where you are standing and looking the cup from, so the cup of the Pharisees is neither clean nor dirty. If you look at the outside, it will be clean. If you look at the inside, it will be dirty. So it's neither clean nor dirty. And that is the hypocritical nature. So if we go to verse 27, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto white sepulchre, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Ala gari akka awwalota noora dibamaniti isan kara ala ijatti midhaguun fakkaatu keessi isaanii garuu lafee warra du'anii fi waan xuraa hundumaatiin guutuudha. So we know what a sepulchre is. A sepulchre is a grave. Awwala maal akka ta'e beektu. So they are likened to a grave. Awwala jiniin wal fakkeeffaman. And how a grave is usually outside is beautiful because of the roses and the flowers that have been laid there. But inside the grave is men's dead bodies. Dead bodies. So it's beautiful outside, ugly inside. So it's neither beautiful nor ugly. So if I may ask us, where do we find this language? Another place we can find this language being used in the Bible. Where do we find it in the Bible? Revelation chapter 3 verse 14. This is the condition of Laodicea. The Bible says they are neither warm nor cold. But also the Bible calls Laodicea blind. So Christ is saying these words to the leaders of the Jewish church. So in other words, what is happening at this time, the Jewish church has sunk into a Laodicean condition. And because they have sunk to a Laodicean condition, that is where God's glory has departed from them. So that is when now God calls them, your house is left until desolate. Because the Jewish church is falling, well, as we read from the Desire of Ages, the Christian church is being established. So that is the condition of the Jewish church at that time. So does that make sense? So now I want us to move back to the book of Matthew chapter 24. So now we've located that the book of Matthew chapter 24 is in the year 31 AD. That is the historical context of the book of Matthew chapter 24. And we said in our first lesson that what Christ is speaking about the destruction of the temple.
Kiristoosii yeroo waa'ee sanaa dubbatu waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa akka ta'e barnoota keessa.
Destruction of the Jewish temple.
Diigamuu waldaa Yihuudootaa.
So we know when is the Jewish temple going to be destroyed?
Yeroo kamidha waldaan Yihuudootaa kan inni diigamu?
70 AD.
AD 70 irratti.
So Christ is in 31 AD.
Kiristoos 31 keessa.
And he is talking about the destruction of the Jewish temple.
31 keessa ta'ee waa'ee diigamuu waldaa Yihuudootaa dubbata.
That is going to happen at 70 AD.
70 keessa kan ta'u jechuudha.
So now, if we go to verse 38, back to verse 38, chapter 23, verse 38. Christ tells them, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And that is the last time Christ was in the Jewish temple. He never went back again. He departs from the temple never to go back because the temple has been destroyed. So when we come to chapter 24 verse 1, it says, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to shew him the buildings of the temple.
Jesus mana qulqullummaa keessa ba'ee utuu adeemaa jiru bartoonni ijaarsa mana qulqullummaa isaatti agarsiisuudhaaf dhufanii jedha.
So while the disciples showing Christ the building of the temple,
maaliif bartoonni kan isaan ijaarsa mana qulqullummaa sanaatti agarsiisan?
Because Christ in verse 38 has already told them, your house is left unto you desolate.
Sababiin isaa lakkoofsa 38 keessatti manni keessan onaa ta'ee isiniif hin hafaa jedheera Kiristoos.
So why do the disciples need to show Christ the building of the temple?
Maalitti agarsiisuu barbaadan waa'ee ijaarsa mana qulqullummaa sanaa? They tried to tell him that this kind of building will not be destroyed.
Because when they look at the temple, then you have to go back to John chapter 1. When they are asking him for 46 years, this temple was built, but you want it to be destroyed in 3 days. So it's the same dilemma when we come at the end. So verse 38 is telling them this temple will be destroyed. All has been destroyed. So the disciples in disbelief will call Christ and show him the building of the temple and the architecture of the temple. They are telling Christ it's not possible for this architecture to be destroyed. So now in verse 2, Christ is going to affirm that he is serious with what he is saying. So he tells the disciples, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown out. So verse 38 says, your house is left unto you desolate. In verse 1, the disciples in disbelief, they come and show Christ the buildings of the architecture of the temple. And they tell him, when you look at this architecture, it's not possible that it's going to be destroyed. So what then Christ does in verse 2,
lakkoofsa lamarratti kan inni isaanitti
he reaffirms what he had said in verse 38.
lakkoofsa 38 keessatti isa isaanitti dubbate irra deebi'ee isaanii mirkaneessaa jira.
And then in verse 2, he reaffirms the destruction of the temple.
Diigamuu mana qulqullummaa kanaa.
So from that concept, because what he says in verse 38 is the same thing he'll reaffirm in verse 2.
38 irratti waan jedhetu lakkoofsa lama irratti irra deebi'ee.
Or in other words, he's repeating the same words he had spoken in verse 38.
Isuma sana irra deebi'a.
So we said when you repeat the same thing and add some information, how do we call that?
Yeroo waanuma sana irra deebitanii odeeffannoo dabalataa kennitan maal jedhamanne?
Repeat and enlarge.
Irra deebi'anii bal'isanii ibsuu jedhama.
So Matthew chapter 24 verse 2
Maatiyyoos 24 lakkoofsi 2
is a repeat and enlarge of verse 38.
irra deebii fi bal'isuu lakkoofsa 38.
So your house has been left unto you desolate
Manni keessan onaa ta'e isiniif hinaaf kan jedhe
is the same as the destruction of the temple.
diigamuu mana qulqullummaa wajjiniin tokko.
So therefore in verse 38 what Christ means
lakkoofsa 38 irratti wanti Kiristoos jedhaa jiru
is that the temple has been destroyed.
manni qulqullummaa badeera diigameera jechuusaati.
Because your house has been left you into desolate, according to verse 2, is the destruction of the temple.
Manni keessan onaa ta'e isiniif hinaaf inni jedhu akka lakkoofsa 2 irratti diigamuu mana qulqullummaa sana.
So Christ is telling them your temple has been destroyed.
Kiristoos maal jedhe isaanitti maa jira manni qulqullummaa keessan diigameera.
But we know this 31 AD.
Inni yeroo isaan kana dubbataa jiranii AD 31 irratti.
And the temple is only destroyed in 70 AD.
Manni qulqullummaa kun garuu kan inni diigame AD 70 irratti.
So what does Christ mean
Kiristoos kan inni jechaa jiru
when he tells them that the temple has been destroyed in 31 AD?
manni qulqullummaa AD 31 irratti diigameera kan inni jedhu
What is the meaning of Christ's word?
hiikaan dubbii Kiristoos maali? Hiikaan isaa maali?
We know historically it's not true that the temple was destroyed in 31. It was only destroyed in 70 AD.
Amaan manni qulqullummaa sun kan inni diigame AD 70 irratti hin diigamne 31 irratti garuu manni keessan onaa ta'eera yookaan badeera kan inni jedhu waa'ee maaliiti?
So he's saying it's prophecy, but I want to call them 31 AD was a sign.
31 milikitaa kan jedhudha.
Or we call it an harbinger.
Dura deemaa isa jedhu.
Or we call it an herald.
Yookaan waan sana kan dursee himu.
All this was an earnest. An earnest. Okay, I'll explain this. If we go to 677 AD,
bara 677 yoo deemtanii
Ellen White in PK 677 will say Manasseh was to be an earnest of what is going to come in the time of Joachim, Joachim and Zedekiah.
Minaaseen qabdiidha jetti Joachimii fi Joachimii fi Zedekiyaatti waan ta'uuf jiru qabdii kennameetti Minaaseen kanaaf inni kun qabdiidha jechuudha.
So an earnest is a down payment.
Qabdiidha jechuudha earnest jedhamu.
So it's a sign of what was going to come.
Milikiita wanta dhufuuf jiruuti.
So this is the sign they asked you for earlier on. Do you remember?
Milikiita gaafachaa turan yaadattu.
And Christ will give this sign in 31 AD.
Milikiita kana AD 31 keessatti isaaniif kennaa jira.
And now Christ gives this sign. He tells them by Christ departing the temple,
Kiristoos milikiitiin isaanii kennaa jiru mana qulqullummaa irraa yeroo adda ba'u.
That was a sign, only it was a down payment of what was going to befall the temple in 70 AD.
Milikiita yookaan wanta AD 70 keessatti ta'uuf jiruu fi mallattoodha jechuudha.
So now in verse 2, what Christ is doing, both in verse 38 and verse 2, is telling them the temple has been destroyed, but it has not been destroyed per se.
Lakkoofsa 38 jechuudha. Akkasumas 24 lamarratti manni qulqullummaa baduusaa yookaan diigamuusaa kan inni dubbatu garuu qaamaan manni qulqullummaa kun hin diigamne.
He is giving a sign of what is going to happen in relation to the temple in 70 AD.
Mallattoo kennaafii jira AD 70
So now I want us to pay attention to verse 3 and see the questions that the disciples are going to ask Christ.
lakkoofsa 3 irratti xiyyeeffannoo kennanii bartoonni Kiristoosiin gaaffii isaan gaafachuuf jedhan akka laaltanii barbaadu.
So, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him private, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of the coming and the end of the world?"
Akkuma Yesuus gaara ejersaa gubbaa taa'een bartoonni gara isaa dhufanii kophaatti nutti himi kun yoom ta'a milikinni dhufa keetii kan dhuma barichaas maali jedhan.
So that is where we left and we said we'll pick from that point.
Achirratti dhaabbanne asirraa itti fufnaa jenne.
So if you go to verse 2,
gara lakkoofsa lamaa yoo deemtan,
which is the same as verse 38,
lakkoofsa 38 ejjineen sumaa.
Christ is speaking about the destruction of the temple.
Kiristoos waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa.
So when he reaffirms about the destruction of the temple in verse 2,
lakkoofsa lamarratti waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa kana yeroo isaanii mirkaneessu,
the disciple will go to the Mount of Olives
bartoonni gara gaara ejersaa deemanii
and they will privately ask Christ,
qofaatti Kiristoosiin gaafatan.
"Tell us, when will these things be? When is the end of the world, and when is the Son of Man going to come?"
Nutti mii kun yoom ta'a, yoomii dhumni barichaa, ilmi namaas yoom dhufaa jedhani.
So the question was,
gaaffichi kan inni ture,
while the disciples asking Christ about the end of the world and the second coming.
bartoonni kan isaan gaafachaa jiranii waa'ee xumura addunyaa fi waa'ee dhufaatii lammaffaa yeroo ta'u,
because there is nowhere Christ has discussed about the second coming of Christ. He has just discussed the destruction of the temple.
garuu Kiristoos immoo waa'ee xumura addunyaa kanaas hin dubbanne, waa'ee dhufaatii lammaffaas hin dubbanne. Kan inni dubbate waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa kanaati.
So Ebenezer, why are they bringing the second coming of Christ in?
Maaliif waa'ee dhufaatii Kiristoosiin kan isaan kana keessa fidaniif?
Why are they not asking a question in relation to the destruction of the temple?
Waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa maaf hin gaafanne? Waa'ee dhufaatii lammaffaa maa gaafatan? Maaltu walitti fide?
They must understand what Jesus says.
Sorry?
Why Jesus said, and when they get
Translate
ready,
that.
They didn't understand what Christ has said.
Or they didn't understand what Christ had said.
That's
Right.
what she's saying.
Okay, that is fair.
That's why they asked about his second coming rather than asking
About the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
But they understood. That is why we have verse 1.
Hubataniiru lakkoofsa tokko keessatti sana
When Christ says the temple is going to be destroyed,
yeroo Kiristoos manni qulqullummaa
they show him the architecture and they tell him there is no way this architecture is going to be destroyed.
itti agarsiisanii ijaarsa kana fakkaatutu diigama akkamitti.
And Christ reaffirms that in verse 2, so they know that the temple is going to be destroyed.
Sana irra deebi'ee mirkaneessee fi beekuu jechuudha akka manni qulqullummaa.
So why do we think they are bringing in the point about the second coming of Christ?
Maaliif waa'ee dhufaatii lammaffaa gaafate?
Yes. Mutuma?
They thought that the temple will remain undestroyed until the second coming of Christ.
We are almost there. So they thought the temple will remain undestroyed until the second coming of Christ. So we are almost there. Daniel,
But
I want to say, like,
what do you think?
they expect that temple is already established, it is eternal.
Mm-hmm.
So the second coming must be happened, it will be happened. So they expect the second coming, the temple already exists on the earth.
The temple already exists or has been destroyed.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we are getting there. So who are before the disciples joined Christ? We've already looked before the disciples joined Christ.
bartoonni tu Kiristoosiin bira dhufanii
Who are their teachers?
eenyutu isaanii barsiisaa ture?
The scribes and the Pharisees.
Farisootaa fi beektuu macaafaa turani.
And in the mind of this, what is the scribes and Pharisees teaching the disciples?
Maal isaan barsiisaa turan isaan kun?
Is that connected to the destruction of the temple?
Diigamuu mana qulqullummaa kanaatiin ol qabatamu?
Is the second coming of Christ?
Moo dhufaatii Kiristoos lammaffaa?
Because you see, where was the temple? Where is the temple located?
Eessatti jira manni qulqullummaa kuni?
Jerusalem.
Yerusaalemiin jira.
And Jerusalem is not like Addis Ababa, it's a fenced city. Jerusalem was a walled, a fenced city.
Akka Finfinnee miti Yerusaalemiin magaalaa
So there are walls around Jerusalem,
Dallatu jira tinanne.
and the temple is within Jerusalem.
Wanni qulqullummaa sun immoo Yerusaalem keessa jira.
So they know for you to get to the temple,
Gara mana qulqullummaa kanaa dhaquuf
you must have destroyed the walls first.
jalqaba maaltu diigamuu qaba, dallaan sun diigamuu qaba.
So what the Pharisees are teaching is that the point when the walls of Jerusalem will come down and the temple will be destroyed is when Christ is going to come.
Kan isaan barsiisaa jiranii yeroon itti dallaan sun diigamee manni qulqullummaa diigamu yeroo sana Kiristoos.
Are we together?
Yeroo sana Kiristoos.
So they know that in relation to the destruction of the temple
Diigamu mana qulqullummaa sana wajjin wal qabatee
is the second coming of Christ.
Kiristoostu dhufaa kan
Because that is what the Pharisees has taught them.
Fariisonni isa sana isaan barsiisan.
Therefore, then, because Christ has told them the temple is going to be destroyed in verse 2,
Kiristoos lakkoofsa lama keessatti manni qulqullummaan diigama jedhee.
so then they know when the temple will be destroyed, the second coming of Christ will happen.
Kanaaf waan baratan sanarraa yeroo itti manni qulqullummaa sun diigamu Kiristoos hin dhufu.
So that is why in verse 3 they'll ask or introduce a question about the second coming of Christ and the end of the world.
Kanaaf lakkoofsa sadii irratti kan isaan waa'ee dhufaatii lammaffaa fi waa'ee xumura addunyaa.
Because they are relating the three events, they know the temple will be destroyed, Christ will come.
Isaan kana lamaan taateewwan kana lamaan walitti fiidhu waan ta'eef yeroo manni qulqullummaa diigamu Kiristoos dhufa.
And when the Son of Man comes, what happens? The world ends.
Yeroo inni namaa dhufu immoo addunyaan maal taati hin xumuramti.
So do we see the mind of the disciples?
Wantu sammuu isaanii keessa akka jiru keessa.
So Christ is discussing about the destruction of the temple.
Kiristoos waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa isaa.
But they know in relation to the destruction of the temple is the coming of the Son of Man.
Diigamuu mana qulqullummaa kana wajjin immoo dhufaatii ilma namaa ta'a kan jedhu.
And when the Son of Man comes, the world ends.
Yeroo ilmi namaa dhufu immoo addunyaan kun hin xumuramti.
So that is why we see the question in relation to the end of the world and not in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Kanaaf gaaffiin suni kan isaan gaafatan waa'ee xumura addunyaa kana wajjin waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa ta'uu ta'a.
Does that make sense? Alright, so if we go to verse 3, so at this point I like everyone to have their Bible because I'm going to ask some questions. So how many questions are we seeing in verse 3? Okay, so I'll give us a minute to get there. So we are there?
2.
Okay, so if we go to verse 3, so how many questions are we seeing? I just need specific answers. How many questions? How many questions in verse 3?
2 questions.
Alright, so let me just create some space for this. So this is Matthew chapter 24,
26.
verse 3. Right? So how many questions? 2 questions?
2 questions.
Translate to that. How many questions are you seeing? 2 questions. So tell us the questions. The first question you translate for me.
24 or 23? Shadi gambar.
Right. So we will come. 3 questions.
Yes.
So tell me the questions.
Nuttimi. Daafii tokko nuttimi. Kuyyoomtaa.
Tell us this, when will this happen?
So the first question will be, tell us when shall these things be? Right? So that is the first question. Is that what she's saying?
Yeah.
Right? What is the second question?
Kuyyoomtaa. Milikkilli dhufa keetis kan dhuma barbaadu.
When shall these things be? That is the first question. So the second question is the sign.
Kuyyoomtaa.
Right? And what is the third question?
Milikkita Bilikita dhufateeti kan dhuma barichaas.
The end of the world. The
So-
sign of the end of the world.
All right. So what we have in
Kan
verse.
kee kan dhuma barichaa.
So the first one will be, when shall these things be? The second one will be, what shall be thy coming? So I missed that, sorry. Because if we take out when or what, it doesn't become a question.
Okay.
So the next question will be, what, right, shall be
Sign of the coming.
the sign of your coming? Right? So the third question will be,
The end of the
End of
world.
the world.
no, I just want the word that will start big, otherwise it doesn't become. Oh, what will be the end of the world? So what will be end of world? Right? So what's your name again?
Makanki.
Ayyaantu.
Ayyantu.
Right. So this I'll use A to notify. So I want to sing three questions.
Yes.
When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of the coming, and what
The end of the world.
the end of the world will look like? So three questions.
Gaaffii sadii.
All right.
Yeah.
Daniel, how many questions in verse 3?
Listen to it.
3 questions. All right. Do you have any contrary opinion?
Yaada addaa namni qabu jira.
How many questions? Hanem, yeah. How many questions in verse 3? 3 questions. So we agree that we are seeing 3 questions in verse 3.
Walii irra gaaffii sadii akka jiru.
Lama jira.
Sanii
2 questions. So tell us the questions.
Yoom ta'a kan jedhu dhufni kee yoom ta'a wajjin wal qabata yoom ta'a kan jedhu asuma gaaffii lammaffaa sana wajjin wal qabata.
Kam kuniif kunu. Let's do ask them. To him.
So when shall these things be?
The sign of your coming.
The sign of the coming. Alright. So the first question is,
Kun tokko.
when shall these things be?
That means he's saying it is the same way as the sign of
Which
coming.
is the sign of the coming.
Yeah.
Right? So that is the first question. The second question will be, what will be the end of the world? Okay? So 3 questions. What's your name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
David.
Yes.
Alright. So we either have 3 questions in Matthew chapter 23 or we have 2 questions.
Gaaffii sadii immoo gaaffii lama qabna.
So 3 questions or 2 questions.
Gaaffii sadii jiru gaaffii lama qabna.
Do you have another way of seeing more than that?
Namni sana olitti argaa jiru jira. Namni sana olitti argaa jiru jira. Afur kan jiru, shan kan jiru jira.
Right? So we either agree it's either 3 questions or 2 questions in relation to verse 3 of Matthew chapter 24.
Kamitti walii galla sadii namoo lama kan jiru.
We are at Concord, we are in agreement.
Walii galleerra.
It's either 3 or 2. I mean, like, we don't have another opinion outside this.
Ija. Kanaalee hin qabnu ni.
Alright, okay. So, what I want us to do
Wanti akka goonu barbaadu.
is that I want to introduce a technique that already, like, I've taught you people.
Tooftaadhumaan isin barsiise akka fayyadamnu hin barbaada.
And I want us to use compare and contrast.
Tokkoffaa, let me say something about this one.
Alright. We are coming this way.
Because translation is difficult for comparing the contrast.
Okay,
I have to tell them.
Okay.
Comparing the contrast gaafa jennu kaleessa waan lama nutti agarsiiseera argitanii turani. Let me use the pen. Waan lama. Compare kan jedhu isiniin waan ta'eef comparing the contrasting jedha. Isiniin compare gaafa jennu lamaan kun maaliif
Markerii.
Markerii waliin dorgomu jechuudha. Yaa markerii lamaan isaanii. Waa'ee waan tokkooti. Markerii.
ኮምፔር ስለ ሲሚላሪቲ ሳይሆን ኮንትራስት ደግሞ ልዩነት መሆን ይችላል።
ኮንትራስት እስመት ደግሞ ኮንትራስት ጋር ጀምሩ ለማን ኩኒ ማለት ነው ኮምፔር ይላል
Markerii ለማን ሳኒ
ኮንትራስት አደዱማ ዛሬ ማለት
ዲማክ ብራ
ከለሪ ሳኒቱ አደደ ቢፋ ሳኒቱ አደደ ከናፊ ጋፍዋ ወልበረቀምኑ ወልፈካቲ ሳኒፊ አደዱማ ሳኒ ሳንጋራጋሩማ ሳኒ ይብስን ከንቲ ይብስን ወጭ ቶፍታ ከሰ Ana afaan Oromootti isin compare the contrast in jira.
You have understood? So now when we speak about compare, don't take it all right. Okay. Alright, when we speak about compare and contrast,
Why compare the contrast?
I want to explain something in relation to compare and contrast.
Kana again welcome to water for super bad.
One, it can come within one verse.
Tokofa la costo che sta
So you can get one verse, it has compared and contrasted different things.
Takuma che sta la costo dopo che sta wanna dadda compare and contrast with Rwanda.
All it can come in the guise of verses next to each other.
Yo kan bola costo to walitana ni ufan che sta Rwanda.
So I will call it verses following each other.
La costo to walitana ni ufan.
Another way we can see compare and contrast
Kambrani mo
is chapters following one next to each other.
bokonna wan walitana ni ufan che sta Rwanda.
So you can go to one chapter
Bagara bokonna to kodentani
and then the chapter next to it
bokonna ni tanu
is compared to the previous chapter.
bokonna is a draw jinini compare and contrast ta.
I'll give an example. This is like what happens in Romans chapter 6 and Romans chapter 7.
Sakana fakenya kana isini kanu Rome bokonna jaabe Rome bokonna torba.
So Mtuma, for those of us who are in Gimbi, you remember this, how we compared and contrasted Romans chapter 6 and Romans chapter 7.
Warigim bitutan kana betu Rome bokonna jaabe Rome bokonna torba kan.
So to give us clue, if you go to the book of Romans chapter 6, it's speaking about baptism.
Wahi kawa isini kanu abe Rome bokonna jaabe wahi tu patan dubatu.
But it's using the agriculture model.
Fakenya konna fayadam.
If you go to the book of Romans chapter 7,
Gara Rome bokonna torba yodenne
it's still speaking about baptism.
wahi matu paru pata
But as this correctly saying, it is now using the marriage model.
fakenya gaila kanine dubatu.
So those two chapters, you can compare and contrast them and understand baptism.
Kanafi gara bokonna wan kana dem tani wal baraka da nero wal madal tani wahi tu pawatu jetu.
Another way we can see compare and contrast, we can find chapters far apart.
Kambara kani compare and contrast ke satelalu bokonna wan wal raha gojiran ke.
An example is Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7.
Fakenya kana Daniel bokonna lama Daniel bokonna torba.
We know Daniel chapter 2 is speaking about the rise and fall of kingdoms.
Daniel bokonna lam wahi kumsati kufati motati.
Daniel chapter 7 will take up the same for the rise and fall of kingdoms.
Daniel bokonna torba sisuma kana.
So there are chapters apart, but you can compare and contrast them.
Bokonna wan ko wal raha ko dagaru wan kana wal.
Another example could be Revelation chapter 12 and Revelation chapter 17.
Fakenya kambara mulatu bokonna ko lama mulatu bokonna ko torba.
Or Revelation chapter 13 and Revelation chapter 17.
Mulatu bokonna ko sadiyo kana fi mulatu bokonna.
They are far apart, but you can compare and contrast them.
Wal raha gojiru garu sankana wal baraka dani madaran des.
So an example I want us to use here.
Fakenya asrati akasim fayadam tambarbadu.
Now when we come to the Gospels,
Gara wangelo tagafa dufnu.
we know they speak of this, some verses speak of the same thing, but they are far apart.
La portion de toko wai mo wan toko asa garo le raha gojiru.
So in an attempt to solve it, we have 3 questions or 2 questions in Matthew chapter 24 verse 3.
Matius di temia fulla cosa sani ke sete gafila mo gafisa di jira kanjiru furud afi.
I want us to go to its equivalent in the Gospels.
wangeelota kan biraa keessaa
In other words,
annee ilaallaa
I'm saying the prophecy given in the book of Matthew chapter 24,
jecha biraadhaan raajiin Maatiyoos boqonnaa 24 keessatti kenname
we can find it in other gospel books.
wangeelota kan biraa keessas jira.
So where do we find the prophecy given in Matthew chapter 23? Sorry, chapter 24.
Raajiin Maatiyoos boqonnaa 24 keessatti kenname wangeela kan biraa eessatti argama?
Where can we find it in other gospels?
Eessatti argama kan biraa? Eessatti argama? Because Luke chapter 21.
Luke chapter 21. Which verse? Because I just want specifically the one that speaks to verse 3. So let me delete this and write them well as you look at which verse. I just want an equivalent in Luke.
Lukas 21. 7.
So if you go to the book of Luke, is Luke 21 verse 7.
Yeah.
Do we have another book that gives the same prophecy? So this is mine. So in Luke is correct. So what is the equivalent in Mark?
I think Mark 13.
All right, Mark 13. So find the specific verse.
Verse 4.
Verse 4 is correct. 3 and 4, right?
Yeah.
3 and 4. So what shall be the sign of the coming? So just remain in Mark chapter 13, verse 3 and 4. All right. So let's go to Mark chapter 13, verse 4, 3 and 4. So what I'm saying, the same prophecy that is given in Matthew chapter 24
Raajiin boqonnaa 24 keessatti kenname raajiin wal fakkaatan
is the same prophecy that is given in Mark chapter 13.
Maarqos boqonnaa 13 keessatti kenname tokkuma.
The same prophecy is given in the book of Luke chapter 21.
Raajiin Lukas boqonnaa 24 keessatti kenname tokkuma.
So I want us to compare all of them.
Isaan kan hundumaa akka wal bira qabnu barbaada.
All right. So if we go to the book of Mark chapter 13 verse 3 and 4,
Maarqos boqonnaa 13 lakkoofsa 3 afur dubbistani.
in fact is chapter in fact is chapter 4, but he says and he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple. Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately.
Yesus gaara jalsaa gubbaa gara mana qulqullummaatti garagalee utuu taa'u Phexros, Yaaqoob, Yohaannis fi Andriyaas kophaatti isa gaafatan.
So I want us to go back to Matthew chapter 24 verse 3 and see something.
Maatiyoos boqonnaa 24 lakkoofsa 3 irra dhattanii akka waan tokko ilaaltanii barbaada.
Matthew chapter 24 verse 3 says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying.
Maatiyoos boqonnaa 24 lakkoofsa 3 irratti kan inni jedhu 24 lakkoofsa 3 irratti bartoonni isaa dhufanii isa gaafatanii jedhu.
So if you go to the book of Matthew, it's the disciples asking Christ.
Matos for lakkoofsa sadii irratti bartootatu gaaffii gaafateera.
So if you go to the book of Mark chapter 3 chapter 13 verse 3,
Marcos boqonnaa 13 lakkoofsa sadii irra yoo laaltan garuu
he says, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple.
gaara ijaarsaarra taa'ee
Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately.
Petros, Yaaqoob, Yohannisii fi Indiriyaas qofaatti isa gaafatan jira.
So in Matthew, it's just the disciples.
Maatiyos keessatti bartoota kan jedhu qofa argina.
But now, Mark 13, verse 3 repeated and enlarges what Matthew had told us.
Marcos boqonnaan 13 wanta Maatiyos jedhe sana irra deebi'anii bal'isanii.
And now he's going to define who those disciples are specifically.
Bartoonni sun eenyu faadha kan jedhu argina asirratti.
So it tells us it's Peter, James,
Petros, Yaaqoob,
John, and who?
Yohannisii fi
Andrew.
And Andrew.
Yohannisii fi Indiriyaas.
So it's not all the 12 disciples that are having a conversation with Christ.
Bartoota 12 sana hundumaa miti kan Yesuus ittiin dubbachaa turan.
Can we see that?
Argaa irraa kana.
So it's going to define which among the disciples specifically is having a conversation with Christ.
Isaan keessaa eenyu akka ta'e kan Kiristoos ittiin dubbataa jiru nutti hima.
So and that is a typical example of how repeat and enlarge works.
Akkamittiin waa irra deebi'anii bal'isuun akkamitti akka inni hojjetu kun
On compare and contrast, it's able to reveal more information that have not been given in the previous chapter.
Compare and contrast gaafa fayyadamnu jechuudha. Odeeffannoo sila hin jirre itti dabalee nutti hima asirratti.
So are we comfortable up to that point?
Amma sanatti walii galle.
Now, let's go to verse 4 of Mark chapter 13.
Gara lakkoofsa afuriidhaan Maarkos boqonnaa 13.
So it says, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled?
Nutti himi kun yoomta wanti kun hundumtinuu yommuu raawwatamuuf jedhu immoo mallattoon isaa maali jedhan.
So now, how many questions when we go to the book of Mark chapter 13?
Maarkos boqonnaa 13 gaafa yaallu gaaffii meeqa argina?
So how many questions in Mark?
Maarkos keessa gaaffii meeqa?
2 questions.
Gaaffii lama.
Now, I'll take that. What is the name of the one in white? Are you in Mark chapter 13 verse 3?
Maarkos boqonnaa 13 lakkoofsa 3 ilaalaa marginatti fakkaata.
How many questions?
Gaaffii meeqa?
2 questions.
Gaaffii lama.
So tell us the questions.
Nutti himi gaaffichi.
So you'll translate to me.
Gaaffii achi keessatti arginu lamaan maal fa'a? The first question is when this shall happen.
When shall these things be?
Lammaffaan.
Right? And what is the next question?
When all these things are going to happen, what are the signs?
So what shall be the sign? What shall be the sign when these things should be? Okay. These things shall be fulfilled. See, that is the word being used. I don't know how it's, but in English, uses the word fulfilled.
Yeah, the translation is also the same.
All right. So 2 questions in the book of Mark chapter 13 verse 4.
Maarkos boqonnaa 13 lakkoofsa 4 keessa kan jiru gaaffii lamadha.
So I want us to go, the other one was Luke 21 verse
7.
So let's go to its equivalent in the book of Luke, chapter 21, verse 7. So do we all agree that in Mark we have 2 questions? So now let's go to Luke and see, because we are trying to compare and contrast them in an attempt to understand. So Luke chapter 21 verse 7.
Lukas 21
I'm not sure about that. I'll have to get there. Is Dr. Kedida who said it. So give me a minute. If I reach there, I'll be able to confirm. I think verse 7 is correct. Alright? So if we go to Luke chapter chapter 21, verse 7,
Lukas 21
it says, and they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be, and what sign will be when these things shall come to pass?
Isaan immoo yaa barsiisaa kun yoom ta'a? Wanti kun yommuu ta'uudhaaf jedhu immoo mallattoon isaa maali jedhanii isa
So this on her. How many questions?
Gaaffii meeqadha?
Two questions.
No, let's confirm. Are we in Luke chapter 21, verse 7?
Lukaas 21 lakkoofsa 7 dubbisaarta.
You are there? Okay. So, how many questions in Luke chapter 21, verse 7?
Gaaffii meeqadha? 2 questions.
2 questions. Tell us the questions.
Nutti mi gaaffiiwwan kana.
Isaan immoo yaa barsiisa gurgurtaa.
Lord, when shall this be?
So, when shall these things be? That is the first question.
Gaaffii isa jawal qabaadha kuni lammaffaa.
Wanti kun yommuu ta'uudhaaf jedhu immoo mallattoon isaa maali?
When these things shall pass, what is the sign?
So, what sign shall be there? Singular. I'm paraphrasing. What sign shall be there when these things shall come to pass? Okay. So I'll do a summary up to this point, then we'll continue. So we want to understand, or we want to study Matthew chapter 24. Though not in details, because there is a specific thing we want to pick in the purpose of our study. So we went to Matthew chapter 24 verse 1, and we showed we have seen that the disciples are showing Christ the architecture of the temple. And we said the reason why the disciples are showing Christ the architecture of the temple is because they cannot believe, like they are telling there is no way this architecture will be destroyed. And that is a result of what Christ had said in Matthew chapter 23 verse 38. So Christ is going to reaffirm or repeat what he had said in chapter 38 or verse 23. And he affirms that this temple is going to be destroyed. Now the disciples understand that connection to the destruction of the temple is the coming of Christ, and when Christ comes, the world ends. So thus they will not ask a question to Christ not only in relation to the temple, but they also ask him questions in relation to the end of the world. So now, if you go to verse 23,
Gara lakkoofsa 23 gaafa deemtani
they will tell us, when shall these things be?
yoom ta'a kun verse 23 of
No, chapter 24.
chapter 24
Verse 3, they'll ask him, tell us, when shall these things be?
Matos 24 lakkoofsa irratti yoom ta'a kun jedhanii gaafatan.
And I'm saying at the face value, when you look that question,
Yeroo gaaffii sana irra keessa ilaaltanii
I'm saying that is a question in relation to the temple.
gaaffiin suni maaliif wal qabatee fi mana qulqullummaa jiru.
Because in verse 2, he has told them the temple is going to be destroyed.
Sababiin isaa lakkoofsa 2 keessatti manni qulqullummaa kun hin diigama jedhee isaanitti mirwan.
So they'll ask him, when shall these things be? When will the temple be destroyed?
Yoom diigama manni qulqullummaa kun.
So, but they'll add, apart from asking him about the temple,
waa'ee mana qulqullummaa gaafachuutti dabalee
they'll tell him, they'll ask in relation to that, and what shall be the sign of thy coming? Then there will be a comma.
maalidha milikkita dhufaatii keetii
And of the end of the world.
akkasumas immoo xumurri biyya lafaa.
So I'm saying the first question is complete. When shall these things be? That is a question in relation to the temple.
Kanaaf gaaffiin inni jalqabaa guutuudha yoom ta'a kuni kan jedhu mana qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabata.
Now the second part of the question will be, what shall be the sign of thy coming?
Gaaffiin lammaffaani milikinni dhufa keetii maalidha?
And of the end of the world.
Akkasumas immoo milikinni xumura biyya lafaa.
So I'm saying that question is not in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Isaan kuni diigamuu mana qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabatee miti warri kun lamaan.
But because and is used to join two things.
Asitti waan lamatu walitti hidhame waan ta'eef.
In English, I want to believe the same in Oromo.
Afaan Oromoo keessatti waan tokko dhahee naman waan lamaan isaa walitti hidhamu isaa jechuudha.
It's Willie and Dr. Kedida.
Wiilii fi Qadiidaa.
So it's used to join two things.
Waan lama walitti hidhe.
So I want to say that one question we see in verse 3 is two questions.
Inni lakkoofsa 3 keessa jiru gaaffii lamadha jechuudha.
The first thing will be, what shall be the sign of thy coming?
Inni tokkoffaa milikinni dhufa keetii maalidha kan jedhu.
So if we break them to two, if and is used to join two things,
yoo iddoo lamatti baasne yookaan cabsine
we can break the second part and call it, what shall be the end of the world?
maalidha xumurri addunyaa kanaa.
So the first part becomes, what shall be the sign of the coming?
Inni kutaa tokkoffaa isaa isa sana gaafa iddoo lamatti qunne.
We remove and break it down so it becomes, what shall be the sign of the end of the world?
Milikinni dhufa keetii maalidhaa fi milikinni xumura addunyaa kanaa maalidha kan jedhu tokkuma iddoo lamatti cabsine.
So the disciples in verse 23,
bartoonni lakkoofsa
and by the way we said,
adii keessatti
which are these disciples specifically? Who are these?
eenyu faadha bartoonni kuni?
Peter, James, John and Andrew.
Petros, Yaaqoob, Yohaannisii fi Andreas.
We remember that repeated enlarged.
Yaadannamni irra deebi'anii barsiisu.
So they are asking one question in relation to the temple,
Gaaffii tokko mana qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabsiisanii gaafatanii
two questions in relation to the end of the world.
gaaffii lama immoo xumura addunyaa wajjin wal qabsiisanii.
So they, because when they know the temple will be destroyed,
Yeroo manni qulqullummaan diigamu
if Christ tells them when,
yeroo Kiristoos yoom akka ta'e
then they will know the end of the world will be at that time.
xumurri addunyaa sana yeroo sana akka ta'e beeku.
So one question in relation to the destruction of the temple,
tokko diigamuu mana qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabate
two questions in relation to the end of the world.
gaaffii lama immoo xumura addunyaa wajjin wal qabate.
Does that make sense?
Ni hubatama?
Now, when we come to the book of Mark,
Gara Maarqoosiin gaafa dhufnu
they ask, when shall these things be?
isaan kun yoom ta'u kan jedhu gaafatanii.
So is that a question in relation to the temple, the destruction of the temple, or in relation to the end of the world?
Gaaffiin kuni diigamuu mana qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabateeti immoo xumura addunyaa wajjin wal qabateeti inni kun.
Temple.
That is a question in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Kun gaaffii diigamuu mana qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabate.
So in other words, 3a in Mark equals to 4a in Mark.
Kana jechuun maal jechuudha? lakkoofsa 3 yookaan kutaa tokkoffaa Maatiyoosii fi lakkoofsa 4 kutaa tokkoffaa Maarqos tokkodha.
So this question and this question are the same.
Gaaffiin kuniif gaaffiin kun tokko.
Both of them are in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Lamaan isaaniiyyuu maaliif wal qabataniiti manni qulqullummaa diigamuu wajjin.
Now when we come to the second part of Mark,
yeroo kutaa lammaffaa Maarqosin ilaallu,
he asks them, what shall be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled?
maalidha mallattoonni wanneen kun raawwatamuu isaanii.
And I'm saying these things in the second part is referring to these things in the first part.
Wanneen kun gaafa jedhu kutaa lammaffaa keessatti wanneen warra kutaa tokkoffaa keessatti.
Now explain that in the simplest way. I need them to get that.
Okay. Maal jechuudha? What shall be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled? Mallattoon wanneen kun raawwatamu maalidha jedhanii mallattoo sana gaafa gaafatanii waa'ee maalii gaafataa jiru? Waa'ee isa kutaa tokko keessatti ibsame sana gaafataa jiru kan jiru.
So these things in part A.
Wanneen kun wanneen kana wajjin tokko maal jiru?
So therefore when we come to the second question in the book of Mark chapter 13,
yeroo gaaffii lammaffaa
is it a question in relation to the destruction of the temple or a question in relation to the end of the world?
waa'ee diigamuu qulqullummaati moo waa'ee xumura addunyaati?
What do you think in yellow? I don't know your name, but I will survive.
Maqaa keen beeku garuu milikatumaan gaafansi maaliif bakka.
You've got the question?
Gaafichi sii galeera?
I repeat the question.
Gaaficha irra sii deebi'a.
So if you go to Mark chapter 13, the first part,
Maarqos boqonnaa 13 kutaa tokkoffaa isaa yoo ilaalte,
when shall these things be? We have established that is a question in relation to the destruction of the temple.
wanneen kun yoom ta'u kan inni jedhu diigamuu mana qulqullummaa akka ta'e jala murreera.
And we said this question is the same as the one that is asked in Matthew chapter 24.
Isaan kuni yeroo jedhu isa Maatiyoos boqonnaa 24 keessatti gaafatame.
So that is a question in relation to the destruction of the temple. In other words, they are asking, when will the temple be destroyed?
Manni qulqullummaa yoom diigamaa jechuudha.
Now, if you come to the second part of Mark,
Gara kutaa lammaffaa isaa yoo ilaalle
it
Maarqos
says, what shall be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled?
isaan kun yeroo isaan raawwataman milikkiti isa maalidha?
So I'm saying these things in the second part
Isaan kun kan inni jedhu kutaa lammaffaa isaa keessatti
is referring to these things in the first part.
isaan kun isa jedhu isa kutaa tokkoffaa keessaa
But remember, the first part was asking a question in relation to the destruction of the temple.
yaadadhu isaan kan gaafa jedhu diigamuu mana qulqullummaati kan inni.
So now our question is
Kanaaf gaaffiin keenya
the question on the second part in relation to the destruction of the temple or in relation to the end of the world?
isaan kana gaafa jedhu waa'ee xumura addunyaati moo waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa ta'ee jedhu.
Do you get the question now?
Huh? She's saying it's about the end of the world.
It's about the end of the world. That is okay. So now, no, not her. You got the question.
Gaaffiisa sii galeera?
So what is this a question in relation to the end of the world or in relation to the destruction of the temple?
Waa'ee xumura addunyaati moo waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaati?
In relation to destruction of the temple.
Gaaffii diigamuu mana qulqullummaatti wal qabatu.
And I will give reasons why I think it's in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Sababii kennuu nan danda'a maaliif diigamuu mana qulqullummaatti wal qabatu?
It's because Christ is speaking about the destruction of the temple. Do we remember?
Kiristoos waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaatti kan inni haasa'u.
And then they ask him, when shall these things be? Meaning, when will the temple be destroyed?
Yeroo isaan kun yoom ta'u jedhanii gaafatanii manni qulqullummaa yoom diigamaa jechuu isaaniiti.
And now the only thing they add is they want to know the sign before the temple is destroyed. They want to know the sign.
Otoo manni qulqullummaan diigamin wanti isaan gaafachuu barbaadan yookaan waan isaan baruu barbaadanii milikkita.
So one question is asking, when is the temple going to be destroyed?
Gaaffii isaan gaafatan kun egaa yoom manni qulqullummaa kan diigamu jechuudha.
The next question asks, what will be the sign that the temple will be destroyed?
Kita maalitu jira kenna maaman qulqullummaa dhiqatuun diigamu dura.
Does that make sense?
Ni galakuma.
It makes sense. We thank God it did. So what therefore we are saying,
Kanaaf maal jechaa jirra?
in Mark, there is one question in relation to the destruction of the temple. In Matthew, there is one question in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Maatiyus keessa gaaffii tokkotu jira waa'ee diigamuun qulqullummaa kan wal
But
qabatu.
when we come to Mark, we have two questions. Both of them are in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Gara Maarqoosiin gaafa dhufnu gaaffii lama jira, lamaan isaanii iyyuu diigamuun qulqullummaa.
So that is why I left this space there deliberately.
Kanaafanii bakka kana duwwaa dhiise.
Because this question, the second part, is not there in the book of Matthew.
Kana maaliif Maatiyus keessa kutaan lammaffaa kun hin jiru.
But that is what compare and contrast. You see now how compare and contrast is a powerful technique.
Compare and contrastiin amma humna qabeessa akka ta'e argitu.
It helps us see something we could not have seen.
Wanna asitti hin argine asitti akka arginuuf nu gargaara.
So now let's go to Luke.
Gara Luqaasiin deemna amma.
Now Luke chapter 21 verse 7.
Luqaas boqonnaa 21 lakkoofsa 7.
Alright. So I'll wait until you are there.
Amma sinachi keessanitti tan sinani eegaadha. Luqaas boqonnaa 21 lakkoofsa 7 amma baastanitti jechuudha.
So in other words, what to confuse us, this second part is not there in the book of Matthew. Blank doesn't have that second part.
Maatiyus boqonnaa 21 keessa kutaan lammaffaa kun hin jiru.
Okay, so let's go to Luke chapter 21 verse 7.
Luqaas 21 lakkoofsa 7 ammoo.
Mtuma, you are there. How many questions? Luke 21 verse 7. How many questions?
Gaaffii meeqatu jira?
Two questions. Tell us the questions.
Okay.
But you said you were there. So the questions are,
Gaaffiiwwan kun
when shall these things be?
isaan kun yoom ta'u asirratti odeeffamee jira.
And I'm saying no, Mtumba, answer these questions. The first question, when shall these things be?
Isaan kun yoom ta'u
Is that a question in relation to the destruction of the temple or a question in relation to the end of the world?
waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabatamu waa'ee xumura addunyaa wajjin wal qabatu.
About the destruction of the temple. So therefore, the first part of Matthew chapter 24 verse 3a, Mark chapter 4a, and Luke chapter 7a, both of them are asking questions in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Maatiyus boqonnaan 24 lakkoofsa 3 irra kan jiru kutaan tokkoffaasaa. Maarqos 13 lakkoofsa 4 irra kutaan tokkoffaansaa. Luqaas 21 lakkoofsa 7 kutaan tokkoffaansaa. Isaan kun hundumtuu waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa.
So that is the same question in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Isaan kun waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa gaafa.
So now when we come to the second part of Luke 7b,
gaafa laallu
it says, what sign shall be there when this thing shall come to pass?
Milikkita maaltu jira wanneen kun yeroo ta'u.
So if we come back to Mark, I'm going to say when this thing shall be fulfilled is the same to when this thing shall come to pass.
Afaan Oromootti lamaan isaanii tokkuma when these things shall be fulfilled fi shall come to pass in afaan Oromootti yoom ta'a lamaan isaa yoom ta'u.
So fulfilled is come to pass in Luke. Those are the same things. We are able to see that?
Yeah.
All right. Now, the second question in the book of Luke.
Gaaffiin lammaffaan kitaaba Luqaas boqonnaa 21 keessa jiru.
Now, what do you think? Is it a question in relation to the destruction of the temple or is a question in relation to the end of the world?
Waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaati moo waa'ee xumuraa addunyaati? About destruction of the temple.
About the destruction of the temple.
Waa'ee diigamuu mana qulqullummaa.
So therefore, when we come and compare these three prophecies,
Raajiiwwan kana sadan gaafa wal bira qabnee waliin madaallu.
the book of Mark and the book of Luke are exactly the same.
Kitaabni Maarqosiif kitaabni Luqaas tokkumadha.
They have two questions in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Waa'ee diigamuu qulqullummaa wajjin wal qabatee gaaffii lama qabu.
But Matthew has one question in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Maatiyos gaaffii tokkitti gaafata jechuudha.
Are we all happy up to that point?
Amma kanatti
Now, I want us to come to the second part of Matthew chapter 24.
gara kutaa lammaffaa isaatti akka dhufnu barbaada waan
The first question is, what shall be the sign of thy coming?
Maalidha mallattoon dhufaatii keetii?
Now, when you come to the book of Mark,
yeroo gara kitaaba Maarqosiin dhufnu,
I'm saying that portion is not there.
kutaan kun hin jiru.
Instead of them asking about the sign of the second coming, Mark asks about the sign when the temple will be destroyed.
Mallattoo dhufaatii isaatii gaafachuurraa mallattoo diigamuu qulqullummaa raawwanneen kun raawwatamuun kan inni
So this part is not there when we come to the book of Mark.
waa'ee milikkita dhufaatii isaatii kan gaafatu hin jiru jechuudha Maarqos keessatti.
It's still not there when we come to the book of Luke.
Luqaas keessattis kan kana gaafatu hin jiru.
Can we all see that?
Kana arguu dandeenya.
Now we come to the third part of the book of Matthew chapter 24.
Kutaa sadaffaa isaa Maatiyos boqonnaa 24 gaafatu.
What shall be the sign of the end of the world?
Maalidha mallattoon xumura addunyaa kan jedhu?
I'm saying that portion is not there when we come to the book of Mark.
Maarqos keessa hin jiru.
And is still not there when we come to the book of Luke.
Luqaas keessa hin jiru.
We can see that.
Arguu dandeenya kana.
So now when we summarize or if we compare and contrast,
Yeroo kana walitti qabnu yookaan waliin madaallee wal bira qabnee ilaallu,
what then we can do
wanti nuyi gochuu dandeenyu
is use the known
isa duwwaa sana
to fill the unknown. Use the known to fill the unknown.
isa beekamu fayyadamnee isa hin beekamne ittiin beekna.
So what we can simply do,
Salphaamatti wanti nuyi gochuu dandeenyu
we can bring this question that is in Mark and Luke
gaaffii isa Maarqosiif Luqaas keessa jiru fidnee
and bring it to Matthew
Maatiyos keessa
because they are the same prophecy.
waa raajiin isaanii tokkuma waan ta'eef.
So therefore I'm saying Matthew, we can bring the second part B,
Kanaaf Maatiyos kutaa lammaffaa isaa fiduu dandeenya.
and it will be asking about the sign when the temple will be destroyed.
Milikkita yeroo itti manni qulqullummaa
So that let me write in another color because it was not there in scripture. We have compared and contrasted to get that.
halluu kan biraadhaan hin barreessa maaliif dhaabbata qulqullaa keessa hin jiru waan ta'eef.
So I'm saying with that will be what
Kontrastiidhaan finne waan ta'eef.
shall be the sign when these things shall come to pass. Right? So what we've basically done
Wanti nuyi goone
is that we've gone and compared other two prophecies that are speaking about the same subject,
raajiiwwan kan biroo lama waa'ee dhimma tokko warra dubbatanii
and by comparing and contrast,
compare and contrast fayyadamuudhaan
we've used what we know
waan beeknu fayyadamne
to fill the unknown.
isaan beekamne.
So now let's go back to the book of Matthew chapter 24 verse 3. It's a tough exercise, so we'll finish in a short while.
Kanaaf hojii cimaadha yeroo gabaabaa keessatti fixnaan jireenya abbootii lakkoofsa
So let's go back to the book of Matthew chapter 24
Maatiyos boqonnaa 24tti deebina
and start again in verse 1.
lakkoofsa tokkorraa jalqabna.
Now verse 1 was saying,
Lakkoofsa tokko kan inni jedhu
Jesus went out and departed from the temple.
Yesuus mana qulqullummaa keessaa bahee jedha.
So we said if Jesus has gone out and departed from the temple in chapter 24 verse 1,
Boqonnaa 24 lakkoofsa tokko keessatti Yesuus mana qulqullummaa
we
keessaa
must
bahee
go and
jedha.
look at the point when he entered the temple. That is how we study scripture.
Dubbatti deebinee yoo bakka inni mana qulqullummaa seene ilaaluu qabna akkasittiin qoranna waan ta'eef kitaaba qulqulluu.
So my friend in red, when did Christ enter the temple?
Yoomidha Kiristoos kan inni mana qulqullummaa.
Because in verse 24 is departing. So when do we see him entering the temple?
24 keessatti hin seene waan ta'eef hin bahe waan ta'eef yoom seene. in Matthew chapter 21.
So this Matthew chapter 21 verse 12.
Matthew boqonnaa 21 lakkoofsa 12.
He enters the temple and he started teaching.
Mana qulqullummaa seenee barsiisuu jalqabe.
So he will teach in chapter 22.
Lakkoofsa boqonnaa 22 keessatti barsiisaa jira.
In chapter 23 he's still teaching and he's condemning the Pharisees and scribes. Woes of the Pharisees.
Matthew boqonnaa 23 keessattis barsiisaa jira. Fariisota fayyadamu.
And his message is basically you've entered to an audacious condition.
And
because they have entered to an audacious condition in verse 38 of chapter 23, it tells them, your house has been left unto you desolate. So if you read Desire of Ages, Ellen White will say by Christ departing the temple, it showed that the glory had departed from the temple.
However, yeroo Kiristoos mana qulqullummaa sana keessaa bahee ulfinni Waaqayyoo mana qulqullummaa sanatti adda bahee jettiin.
Okay, but the disciples in disbelief, they go and take Christ and ask him, what do you mean this temple can be destroyed? So they are going to show him the temple.
Waan inni jedhe amanuu dhabuudhaan bartoonni dhaqanii akka maal jechuu keeteef manni qulqullummaa kun hin diigama yoo jettu.
So we've said, why are the disciples showing Christ in the temple?
Maaliif mana qulqullummaa sana itti agarsiisanii bartoonni Kiristoositti? Maaliif? You're saying why?
Yeah, why are they showing him the temple?
Maaliif mana qulqullummaa sana itti agarsiisan Kiristoositti bartoonni? It was built for a long time.
Yeah, because when they look at the architecture, they don't believe the temple is going to be destroyed. So Christ will reaffirm the same thing in verse 2. So we said Matthew chapter 24 verse 2, it's a repeat and enlarge of which verse?
Irra deebi'uu fi bal'isuu lakkoofsa kamiiti? Maatiyoos 24 lakkoofsi 2 irra deebi'uu fi bal'isuu lakkoofsa kamiiti?
No, not her, no him. No him, yes, him.
Irra deebi'uu bal'isuu lakkoofsa kamiiti? Maatiyoos 24 lakkoofsa 2 maaliif tokko inni? Luqaas 23.
Verse 38, so your house has been left unto you desolate. Is the same as your house has been destroyed. So the temple being left desolate is the same word. We can replace the word desolate with destroyed.
Desolate
but we said that only happens in 31 AD. And we know the temple has not been destroyed in 31 AD. So we said that 1 AD is either a sign or an harbinger or an herald or an earnest of what is coming in 70 AD.
Milikita yookaan mallattoodha yookaan dura deemaadha yookaan wanta ta'uuf jedhu kan himudha yookaan immoo qabdii 70 keessa.
So it's a down payment. You know, like how you do a down payment.
Yeah.
So it's a down payment of what will befall the temple in 70 AD.
Qabdii wanta 70 keessatti ta'uuf jedhuti.
So after Christ has told the disciples the temple is going to be destroyed,
and
we said, who are these disciples who are asking Christ? Their names.
Andreas, Petros, Johannes, Jacob.
Okay, that sounds correct. Peter, James, John, and Andrew.
Petros, Johannes, Jacob, Andreas.
So, and in their mind, they know when the temple will be destroyed, the end of the world will come. So when Christ tells them that this temple will be destroyed, they know therefore at that point, the second coming of Christ, when we have the second coming of Christ, the world will end.
Kanafi manni qulqullummaa kun hin diigamaa jedhee yeroo inni dubbatu yeroo sanatti Kiristoos akka
So that is why we see, although Christ is speaking about the destruction of the temple, the disciples are going to sneak 2 questions about the end of the world.
Kanaaf Kiristoos waa'ee diigamuu qulqullummaa dubbachuu isaa habee kana iyyuu malee saajjiniin wal qabatee dhufaatiin isaa akka ta'u beeku waan ta'eef gaaffiiwwan kana lama.
So in Matthew we see 1 question in relation to the destruction of the temple.
Kanaafitu gaaffii tokko diigamuu qulqullummaa wal qabatee gaafatame.
2 questions in relation to the end of the world.
Gaaffii lama immoo xumura addunyaa wal
qabatee. Mark 13 has just 2 questions in relation to the destruction of the temple. The same as Luke, we just have 2 questions in relation to the destruction of the temple. So using compare and contrast, we brought the second question, we said it must be there because it's the same prophecy, using the known to know the unknown.
Kanafi compare and contrast fayyadamne isa beekamuni isa beekne bakka buufanne.
So now back to Matthew chapter 24 verse 3. How many questions are in verse 3?
Kanaaf Maatiyus boqonnaa 24 lakkoofsa 3 keessa gaaffii meeqatu jira?
No, on her. I don't want chorus answers. The one that is
writing.
Yeah, on the phone.
On the phone.
Yeah. Good. How many questions in verse 3? Of Matthew chapter 24. Right. Okay. So how many questions in Matthew chapter 24 verse 3? 4 questions. Because that is the only thing we've been doing. So using this compare and contrast, you end up seeing 4 questions in Matthew chapter 24 verse 3. 2 questions in relation to the destruction of the temple. 2 questions in relation to the end of the world. Does that make sense, Daniel? So in relation to the destruction of the temple, they want to know when is the temple going to be destroyed, when shall these things be? But they also want to know the sign when the temple will be destroyed. In relation to the end of the world, they want to know the sign when Christ will be coming. And then they want to know the sign when the world will end. 2 questions in relation to the destruction of the temple. 2 questions in relation to the end of the world. Do you have any question up to that point? Who has not understood? So do we see how we end up with 4 questions in verse 3 of Matthew chapter 24? We all can see that? Right. You can ask him.
Okay, then Isuma kanan nuban jeshi ma anu
Alright. I'll give you time.
Magaan ke nutre galan ipo gafin sa disiru major. Nanti isa kana mal fayyadamne compare and contrast fayyadamne iddo duwwaa dhiisee darbe Marcos gaaffii lama gaafate gaaffii lamaan gaafate maal jubal qabata diigamuu mana qulqullummaa jubal qabata Lukas gaaffii lama gaafate gaaffii lamaan inni gaafate maal jubal qabata diigamuu mana qulqullummaa jubal qabata lamaan isaanii iyyuu tokko Maatiyos gaaffii sadii gaafate gaaffii sadii keessaa tokko mana qulqullummaa jika wal qabatu lama xumura addunyaa jika wal qabatu gaafate kanaaf compare and contrast gaafa fayyadamnu isa kana inni kun tokko eenyu Maatiyos miss godhe isa sana barreessine jechuudha tun barreessine kanaaf itti guuttannaa jechuudha Yeroo itti guuttannu gaaffii meeqa argina? Tokko, lama, sadii, afur argina. Wanti irratti barreeffamee jiru garuu meeqadha? Sadii duwwaadha. Comparing contrastidhaan meeqa ta'a? Afur ta'a jechuudha. Miti?
Sarviisi ilaalama egaa. Inni gaafa nama nu sadii qofa.
Gaafa keessa. Sanuu sarviisii fi hidden treasure inni jedhamu.
He has understood?
Yeah.
Warra
So-
nama jechuudha. Maarqosii fi Luqaas immoo waa'ee xumura addunyaa sanaan gaafatan kan isaanii.
Yeah, she's asking this.
Then we will do that in the next. We will do that in the next class. We will do that in the next class. Time is fast.
Matthew 24:3, Mark 33:4, and Luke 21:7. We have understood already. Thank you very much. But one is not clear for me here. Can we say that Matthew 24:3 has two ideas, but there are four questions?
It has two ideas.
To
What does that
subject this, but four questions.
Four questions.
mean? Two subjects, but two questions.
Four questions.
That is what we are saying.
Yeah.
The idea in Matthew chapter 24 is one is the destruction of the temple, two is the end of the world.
Yeah.
But we are saying in relation to the destruction of the temple, we have two questions. One question is asking them, when is the temple going to be destroyed? Another one is asking about the sign when the temple will be destroyed. You see that? When shall these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? What shall be the sign when these things in part B, these things in part A? So one is when the temple is going to be filled, the second part is the sign. You understand? So we have brought that here. So it's two questions in relation to the destruction of the temple, two questions in relation to the end of the world. Two themes, four questions. So what I was asking is how many questions in the book of Matthew chapter 24 verse 23. So I'm saying after comparing and contrast, we can see it's not three questions in Matthew chapter 24, but it's four questions. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to say that. So the first is the A and the B
Yeah.
are the same ideas, but two questions.
Yeah.
And the C and the D, we can say that in place of B, we can say C. C and the D has two ideas. Then one ideas, two ideas, four questions. But we understand as like that, that's problem.
That is okay. I'm in agreement with you. Right? That is okay up to that point?
Yeah.
So we'll come back in the afternoon and then we'll continue with that. I think that is a good place to stop for now, so that I don't overload you with information.
Kan jala reference in the Dapsi Surah Sadi Wali Television.
Okay, really fast.
Gooftaa si galateeffannaa. Addumatti yeroo kanatti waan beekuu qabnu waan nu barsiisuuf deemu. Nuufis sammuu keenya keessatti gaaffii kan ta'e hubannaa kan itti dhabne waan baay'ee jira. Haaluma kanaan akka hubannuuf nu gargaarteetta. Kanaaf si galateeffanna. Ammallee waan baay'ee waan sirraa barru qabna. Kanaaf sammuun keenya baramaa akka ta'u akka hubannu hafuurri qulqulluun akka nu qajeelchu si kadhanna. Amma yoonaatti nu wajjin taatee nu qajeelchitee nu barsiisteetta. Homaa tokko nu mudanne abbaa keenyaa si kadhanna. Amma sagantaan kun xumuramutti nu wajjin akka taatu. Waan hundumaattu akka nu gargaaru. Waan beekuu qabnu tun beekin akka nafne abbaa keenyaa mudannoo kamiillee keessa nu dabarsitee waan nu barsiisuuf saba keetiif erguu barbaadde akka nu gargaaru si kadhanna. Jaalalli kee ulfaatamu maqaa Gooftaa Yesuusiin.